It's at this time that we turn our attention to the reading and the studying of God's Word. Today we're going to continue in this sermon series, Remember, as we approach the celebration of our 130th anniversary as a church community. We're entering into this study, looking at the scriptures and looking at the biblical command to remember. This call to remember, it's all throughout the Bible, but especially the Old Testament, where the Hebrew people are rescued by God, they're redeemed by God, they're blessed by God, and God calls them to remember. And then what ends up happening is the people forget, and they fall astray, and they abandon the Lord their God. And you and I, we both know how easy it is to forget, right? Who can even remember what they had for lunch yesterday, right? We often are a people of short memory. Yet as we enter into this season of remembrance and thanking God for how he formed us as a church community, for how he has preserved us as a church community for 130 years, we want to remember the larger story of how God has redeemed us and rescued us, who he made us to be, the people that he calls us to live as, that we would be a people who daily remember the Lord because we know that our life is nothing apart from him. So if you were able, would you please stand for the reading of the word today? We're going to be looking at a passage from Joshua. We're going to be reading Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 through 24, and it says this. Now when the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe. And command them, saying, take up for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are, standing firmly, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the encampment where you will spend the night." So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. This shall be a sign among you when your children ask later, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall say to them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever." So the sons of Israel did exactly as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, just as the Lord spoke to Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. And they carried them over with them to the encampment and put them down there. Then Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the feet of the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and they are there to this day. For the priests who carried the ark were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And the people hurried and crossed. And when all the people had finished crossing, then the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed in front of the people. The sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over in battle formation before the sons of Israel, just as Moses had spoken to them. About 40,000 equipped for war crossed the battle before the Lord to the desert plains of Jericho. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel so that they revered him, just as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. Now the Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony that they come up from the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, saying, "Come up from the Jordan." It came about when the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord had come up from the middle of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests were lifted up to the dry ground, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and went over all its banks as before. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. As for those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set them up at Gilgal. And he said to the sons of Israel, "When your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, 'What are these stones?' then you shall inform your children, saying, 'Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground.' For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever." The word of the Lord. You may be seated. So last week, we looked at a passage from Deuteronomy. If you remember, Deuteronomy is the end of the first major story of the Bible. In that first section, the first 5 books of the Bible, God made the people of Israel. He formed them. He gave them a promise that they would grow into a mighty nation, that he would bless them, that through the people of Israel, they would be a blessing to the entire world, and that eventually God would give them the promised land. But the people of Israel became enslaved by the Egyptians. And so God rescues his people from slavery, and he leads them out of slavery in this fantastical moment where they come up to the Red Sea, and what God does is he literally splits the sea so that the people of Israel can walk across it on dry land. And that's how God leads his people out of slavery, and he leads them into the wilderness, and he's going to take them to the promised land. But the generation that was rescued from slavery, they actually reject God. And they reject the promise of God, and they reject the blessing that he was going to give them. And so that generation remains in the wilderness for 40 years. And now when we come to this passage in Joshua, a new generation has arisen. And this new generation in Deuteronomy, they received this grand speech from Moses. It was like Moses' last words before he died. And he calls this new generation, remember the story of how God made you. Remember the story of how God rescued you from Egypt. Remember how the Lord your God provided for you in the wilderness. And remember how God had led you to this moment. Now, when we come to Joshua, Moses has died. Joshua has become the new Moses. He's the new leader of the people of Israel. And God is going to do this fantastical thing where this new generation gets to relive the story of the Exodus. God has brought them to the edge of the promised land. There's this river, the Jordan River, that cuts through, and they need to cross it to enter into the promised land. And God stops the people, and he splits the Jordan River so that the people of Israel can walk across on dry land, that this new generation, who was either born in the wilderness or were just mere children during the Exodus, that this new generation would relive that story, that the story of the Exodus would become their own story. And not just that they would relive it, but they would actually experience the fulfillment and the completion of that story. Because unlike the previous generation who rejected the promise and rejected the blessing, this new generation is hungry, and they're willing, and they're ready to enter into the promised land. And God gives Joshua a very simple command. He says, hey, in the midst of this grand story, in the midst of this moment where the people of Israel are going to enter into the promised land, they're going to receive the blessing. There's a new generation that loves me and wants to follow me and wants to receive the blessing I have for them. Before you just venture into the promised land, I want you to stop. And I want you to build a memorial. God gives this command to Joshua to have a man from each tribe of Israel pick up a stone. I guess they had to, pick their favorite stone, whichever one they think was shiny enough. The only real metric is it says they carried them on their shoulders. So I guess it had to be big enough that you could carry on their shoulders, so no like little pebbles. But each man from each tribe picks their favorite big rock from the Jordan River, and they carry it out, and they take it up to Gilgal, and they build a statue. They build a memorial. They build a sign. And God says these stones piled up are going to be a sign that is going to remind you of what I have done. That when you see these stones, it's going to be a symbol, it's going to be a sign that reminds you of how I made you, of how I rescued you from Egypt, how I provided for you in the wilderness, how I'm bringing you into the promised land. And it's not just going to be a sign for you today. No, future generations are going to see these rocks. Your children are going to look at this pile of rocks. And they're going to be like, Papa, Father, what do these stones mean? What do they mean to you? And this will be your response. Well, the Lord made us, and the Lord rescued us, and the Lord provided for us, and he led us out of slavery through the Red Sea, and he's leading us into the promised land through the Jordan. We have a wonderful God who did all these miracles and who loves us. This is what the stones are to be a sign of. See, signs and symbols are powerful because a sign, right? A sign is just something, it's an image or an action that points to something far greater than it, far more complex than it. A symbol is an image or an action that represents something far greater than the simple image or the simple action. And all of us have heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? God designed us in such a way that we can be deeply visual or deeply symbolic, where we can take complex ideas and we can kind of compress them into a neat, tidy little package. And the moment we see that, then it unpacks all of these thoughts and all these emotions and the grand multitudes of pictures of thoughts that are behind that symbol. As Westerners in our current culture, we like to have a really big focus and emphasis on the written word. But that doesn't mean that our culture is lacking symbols. No, symbols and signs are all around us today, right? As Christians, we gather together and we see the symbol and the signs of the cross. We experience the symbols and signs in baptism and communion. In our larger culture, right, we have a symbol that represents our entire government and our entire nation. Like one of the most prominent symbols in our country is our flag, the American flag, which is one simple image. But within it, it represents the entire country we live in, the government that we live in. It represents every state. It represents every town and every city within those states. It represents every person and all of the cultures. And it's not just one singular culture, one singular way of living, one singular belief system, right? The culture that we have here in Altoona is very different from the culture that exists in Philadelphia or in Pittsburgh or in Amish territory. The culture that we have here in Pennsylvania is very different than the culture in New York or in California or in Washington or the Midwest. One simple picture represents a multitude of people, a multitude of cultures, a multitude of opinions and beliefs that all get jam-packed into one simple image. I'll give you another example. There's another prominent symbol within our culture. It's all over the place. I thought about having it up here on the slide, but it's actually far better for me to just kind of describe it, because you'll get the point, because every single person in this room knows what the symbol is and holds the symbol near and dear to their heart, right? You can't laugh. You're here for a service. You're spoiling it. All right. So just, all right. If you would, imagine with me, you can enter your mind palace, which at first, when I heard the phrase mind palace, I thought that was like a modern phrase, but then I read Augustine, who lived in the late 300s, early 400s, and he used that phrase mind palace, so it's a very old phrase. But if you would you imagine with me a gold line? And it's not just a straight line, it's actually a curve. It goes up, and then when it starts to curve back, it actually stops halfway. And then it goes back up again, and it comes all the way down, making this golden arches, right? The golden M, right? You and I, we all know this symbol. It's all over the place, right? It's the McDonald's M, the McDonald's golden arches. And it's so prevalent within our culture that you can barely find a town within our country that lacks the golden arches, right? But that is a powerful symbol. It means a lot. Right, first off, you see the golden arches, you know, this is a place where I can buy hamburgers and French fries, right? This is a place where I can eat. But you and I both know that the golden arches doesn't just represent a place where you can buy food. That symbol has grown to such a degree that the golden arches, it really represents the epitome of capitalistic America. Right? The golden arches have gone on to become a symbol of our very culture that has spread throughout the entire globe. We associate a whole cacophony of feelings towards those golden arches, some positive, especially when it's late and you're hungry, to some being very negative, seeing it as a symbol of health crises within our country. Right? That golden M is a simple image, but it means a lot. And it's shaped a lot. And it's influenced us. Right? People who work in advertising and graphic design know the power of symbols. They take entire companies, entire missions, entire desires, and they compress it into a single, easily understood package. There's a reason why the Amazon A to Z arrow is all over the place. That simple image communicates that at Amazon, you can buy anything A to Z, and they will ship it anywhere, A to Z. You and I, we live at a time where we all have magic little devices in our pockets. When you pull up your phone, you unlock it, all you see are symbols that represent anything that you want to do and every desire that you have. If you want to call someone, you hit the little phone symbol. If you want to text someone, you hit the little text bubble, right? If you want to see pictures of your neighbor's dog, there's a little symbol you tap that lets you do that. If you want to shop, there are plenty of symbols for that. If you want to order food, there are plenty of symbols of that. Symbols and signs are all around us. Whether we realize it or not, whether we're cognizant of it or not, we not only understand symbols and signs at an intimate level, but we are shaped and formed by them. And the reason why we are shaped and formed by them is that there's something at work underneath all of those symbols and signs. This command that God gives Joshua, it's not just one command. There's actually two commands here. The first command is very simple, and it's very immediate. Take stones, build a memorial, there'll be a sign. But there's a second, far greater, deeper command laid under the first. And that the second command is for the Hebrew people to be master storytellers. Because the symbol and the sign means nothing if the story underneath it is not understood. Just look in this Joshua passage. There's two instances, one where God commands it and one where Joshua commands it. They give this scenario of, hey, when you build this stone memorial, the stone memorial is going to sit there. It's going to be a sign. And one day your child will say, Papa, what do these stones mean? And what's the command given? Your response will be to tell the story that the sign points to. And God says that these stones are going to be a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. But that only happens if the people of Israel fulfill this calling to know the story and to share the story and to pass the story of how God made them, rescued them, provided for them, and led them to each and every single generation. If that story is lost, the stones are meaningless. The stones are just stones. But the symbol has the power to remind Israel and the power to shape Israel when the story is captured and the story is understood and the story is shared. The real power of the sign is not within the stones itself. The power is in the story underneath the stones. I'll give you an example. Imagine with me, if you will, again, 4,000 years from now. And the United States has been taken over and destroyed and decimated. And we'll pick a random country. We'll say it was Nicaragua, okay? And the Nicaraguans have completely conquered us. They've destroyed everything. And then, immediately after that, an apocalypse hits and wipes out like all of humanity except for a tiny pocket of people. And they survive, and they go on for 4,000 years. And eventually, they send archaeologists to our land to uncover who lived here, what happened, what was going on. And they're digging through the rubble. And they stop, and they see something very strange. There's an object in the rubble that has been somehow preserved. Like it still has its color, it's bright as ever. And it's golden. And this piece of golden metal that's been preserved by some kind of oil is in the shape of an ark. People living 4,000 years later who see the golden arches, if they have no context for it, if they have no knowledge of McDonald's, if they have no knowledge of the story, they'll see those golden arches and they will have no idea what it means. It will mean nothing to them, really. They won't even know which way the object is supposed to be held. Maybe it's an M, maybe it's a W, maybe it's an E, right? They have no idea whatsoever. All those people would know is that they could travel through the land digging up all the rubble and they would find golden arches after golden arches after golden arches after golden arches. They'll have no idea what it actually means. Their best assumption is that there's so many of these golden arches in the rubble of every single town that it must be a grand religious symbol that all of the people gathered around. That's the only logical explanation for why all of these objects are still here, right? Which you and I both know is mostly false, right? The symbol means nothing if you lose the story underneath it. In the same way that you and I, when we see a symbol today, you can take two people who look at the same symbol And they can have wildly different responses to it because they have two different stories in mind. Right? You take the picture of the American flag. To the person who has experienced nothing but freedom, ease of life, prosperity, when they see that symbol, that's the story in their mind. When you take someone who has experienced nothing but hardship, or has been a victim in some way, or is a victim of prejudice, when they see that symbol, that's the story that they have in mind. One symbol can communicate two wildly different things. And it all comes down to the story that is at work underneath it. So you and I, as Christians today, when we hear the story of Joshua, the story of building a stone memorial, and the calling for every generation of the Hebrew people to care for this story, to know this story, to pass this story down, you and I, as Christians today, have to realize this is the same calling for us. As people who have been transformed by the Christ story, the ultimate story, you and I have to hear this call today that just as the Hebrew people were to pass down the story of their redemption from slavery and their entrance into the promised land, you and I must pass down the story to every generation, to our neighbors, to our co-workers, of the good news of Jesus. Right? This story is so transformative. It's the whole reason we've gathered together, that we gather together every single week to share this story and to remind ourselves of this story, that when we receive communion, we receive the body and the blood of Christ. We share the story that Jesus came and lived a perfect life. And he died on the cross, not for any wrongdoing of his own, but to take on our sin and our punishment. And he took our sin to the grave, but he was victorious over the grave. And he rose from the dead. And he now leads us into eternal life, into a new life where the world will be restored and redeemed and made new. That is the story that has brought us here. That is the story that we come to share and remind one another of. And that's the story that we strive to live out. To be a Christian is to be a bearer of the Christ story. Not just to bear it, but to share it. Because stories have power. God designed us to be narrative creatures. Before there was the written word, and before we used symbols and pictures to communicate, the most basic way in which human beings informed one another, shaped one another, preserved their history, taught their beliefs, was just through oral storytelling. There's a reason why God designed the scriptures, that the majority of the Bible is written in the narrative genre, in narrative format. Sometimes we go to the Bible and we wish it were just simple systematic theology, that the Bible was just a list of this is everything you need to believe, this is everything you need to know about God, these are all the things you need to do, these are all the things you need to not do. Boom, done. Sometimes we wish the Bible was like that, but that's not how God designed it. God designed the majority of the scriptures to be a narrative, to be stories, because he designed us to be narrative creatures. The way in which we process and understand the world around us is through forming stories. Simple statements, simple sentences even, that just have a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's the way in which we process everything we see and hear and taste and touch and smell. I'll give you an example. When I was a student at Johnson, I had the wonderful privilege and opportunity to take a class called Theology and Film, which is all about just studying the power of narrative, the power of storytelling, specifically within the focus of film. But it was bigger than that. It was getting at the root of how God designed the art of storytelling in the first place, how God uses the art of storytelling to communicate truth to us, and then how we can do the same to share the good news with other people. And it was while I was taking that class and while I was studying narrative that my wife and I had a very fascinating encounter. We were at church one morning, and it was like, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes before the service started, 10, 15 minutes. And we were standing there in the room. We were talking with another couple. The four of us were just standing there having a delightful conversation. And then we saw this family of four, this family of five enter into the room. And they came in and they sat right in the front row. And they sat there for maybe 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes, not very long at all. And then after 1 or 2 minutes, the dad got up, motioned for everyone to stand up, and then he took them all out, and they all left. And they didn't come back. And the four of us, we were standing there, and we saw this. And we were so confused. We were so perplexed. They weren't a family that we thought we had seen before at the church, but we were just so confused why someone would come in, sit down, stay there for 2 minutes, get up, leave, and not come back at all. It's not like they went to the bathroom or anything. And when the four of us saw this, we were perplexed. We were confused. And you know what the immediate natural gut response was to seeing that? The first thing we did is we started coming up with potential stories, hypotheses for what had caused what we had seen. Maybe this family had come in. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe someone's great uncle had broken their pinky toe and needed immediate help, immediate recovery, right? So they had to rush out. Maybe this family was new to church, or maybe they were from a different church and they had a certain expectation that, someone would say hi to them, welcome them, greet them, etc., and nobody did. And so the dad was super frustrated, got up, said, we're not going to be a part of this church. I don't know. None of us knew. Our immediate response was to try to come up with stories that could explain the situation that we just saw. And you and I, we do this all the time. We think narratively. We think with beginning, middle, and end. We take the things that we see, we take the things that we hear, and we put it into a story because it's the way in which God designed us to make sense of the world. Stories aren't just an expression. They're not just an expression of what we believe. We're shaped and formed by stories. We're inspired by stories. Stories are both inputs and outputs. You might be familiar with the new Superman movie that just came out this weekend. And don't worry, I won't spoil it, Evan. I don't know. Evan was really upset at me because 4 years ago I spoiled a movie in a sermon. He was like, I was going to watch that movie. I won't spoil it. But if you are like me and you're interested in studying modern philosophy and philosophers, then you know that you wouldn't be surprised at all. This new Superman movie is ultra optimistic. It is intentionally corny, and it's super bright, and it's colorful, which is a deep contrast to the Superman movie that came out about 12 years ago, which is the exact opposite, a Superman who is very dark and gritty and angry and edgy. But all the people who are really interested in modern philosophy, they knew exactly what to expect from this movie. A bunch of people, they're actually kind of shocked. It's like, why is a Superman movie so corny or super happy all the time? But it's actually because as a culture, right, 10, 12 years ago, we were at this height, we were at this point of postmodern philosophy, where as a whole culture, we were shaped by deconstruction stories. We actually had a great interest in taking stories and being like, I don't think this story is entirely true. We as a whole society for many decades, especially Gen X and millennials, were very deconstructive. We're very edgy. You just have to look at 2000s nu metal and the fashion of the time to see that. But there's a cultural shift because that whole edgy, deconstructive attitude and culture, it's phasing out. If you actually look at the youngest generation, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they're not about that at all. They're exhausted by deconstruction. They're exhausted by satire and by edge. And they're like, man, there has to be joy in this life, otherwise life isn't worth living. And you're starting to see that. It's the shift from postmodernism to metamodernism. And that's why the stories that we tell as a culture, whether it's in movies, or it's in music, or games, or just what you see people do with their lives, they're going to be much more joyful and much more optimistic because it's born of that root shift. The stories that we tell and we share, it's an input and it's an output. We tell stories based on our beliefs, but then the stories that we hear shape and form, and they change how we think. Stories are powerful because God designed us to be narrative creatures. He designed us to be natural storytellers. And so as people who believe in the ultimate story, the story of Christ, as people who have been radically transformed by the story of Christ, we have to take this call very seriously. Because if we forget the story of Christ, if we lose it, if we miss it, we'll be like the Hebrew people who fall astray, who forget the Lord their God and end up in the wilderness, or who end up in exile. And if we forget, or if we fail the call to share the story, to share the Christ story with our children, with our neighbors, with our coworkers, then the lost will not be reached. Paul is very clear in Romans when he's talking about this exact calling to be storytellers of the story of Jesus. He says, how then are they to call on Christ in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in Christ if they have not heard? And how are they to hear without a preacher? But how are they to preach unless they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. However, they did not all heed the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. You and I have the responsibility to share the word of Christ, that those who don't know Jesus and don't know his love and don't know his redemption and restoration and resurrection, that they may hear and they may believe. It is on us. God has given us the call to share the Christ story through the symbols that we wear or we put up on our walls or we put on our desk at work. We're called to share the story with our words. And most importantly, we're called to share the story of Christ with our actions, with the way in which we live our life. Because this isn't just a story we think about or talk about. It's ultimately a story that is lived out. That if we just share the symbols of Christ, or if we just share the words of the scriptures and then completely fail to live it, we will betray the very story that we are proclaiming. You and I, each and every single one of us, we have the responsibility to know the story so well, for it to sit in our hearts and to be sharers and bearers of it. There are three great dangers or opponents to the Christian storyteller. And there's three distinct callings that we can take up. And I know some of you might be worried that I'm only just now landing at my 3 points in the sermon. But don't worry, they'll be quick. We're landing the plane here. The first danger or opponent to the Christian storyteller is erasure. What the enemy wants to do is he wants to erase the story of the gospel. He wants to eliminate it. He wants to get rid of it because he knows that the story of the gospel brings redemption and forgiveness and resurrection. There's a book came out in the 50s, Fahrenheit 451, that is about this entire idea of censorship and erasure. If you're not familiar with it, I know a bunch of us have read it in like middle school or high school, but in the story of Fahrenheit 451, there's a fascist government that is deeply controlling. What they do is they've set up an entire people, they call the firefighters, that exist to burn every book. Because the government doesn't want stories that could potentially threaten or inspire people to oppose the controlling government. So it's an entire culture where books are banned. And they have firefighters who are not fighting fires, but rather they burn any book that they find and that's reported to them. And the story ends with a group of people, they're rebels who are working against that fascist government. And what do? They don't write the books down. In fact, each and every individual person commits the stories to their memory. And the main character ends up memorizing all of Genesis. And he becomes a living person who bears that story for the rest of his life. What the enemy wants to do is the enemy wants to erase the story of Jesus. He wants to silence it. He wants to eliminate it. And that means you and I, as Christian storytellers who are telling the ultimate story, the story of Jesus, we have the calling to preserve that. We have a great history where you can look at 2,000 years of Christian history where men and women have dedicated their entire lives. Not just dedicated their entire lives' work, but have even been martyred and killed for trying to preserve the scriptures. And because of their great work, you and I can know that what you're reading today in that Bible are the same words that were written 2,000 years ago. You and I, we must preserve the story of Christ. We must carry it. We must say it. We must live it out in every way so that it is not erased and is not silenced. The second danger or opponent to the Christian storyteller is maybe far more prevalent than the danger of erasure. It's the danger of overabundance. In the world in which you live in, because of technology, you and I, we encounter 1,000,001 different stories within a minute. You open up your phone, you open up social media, you go to Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, anything like that. You turn on the TV, it's just boom, 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 boom. What the enemy wants to do is if he can't erase the story of Jesus, if he can't silence it, then what he wants to do is he wants to bury it. And you and I as Christians, you know we live in a world of constant information, constant information. It does not take long for you to open up your phone and to immediately see things you love and agree with, to go into immediate rage and opposition. And all it does within us is it just makes every story meaningless. It creates nothing but rage or apathy within us. You and I as Christians, we must be people of great wisdom and discernment and clarity who have the ability to cut through the noise, who with great wisdom and great discernment are able to understand what is true. We have to be people who know the Christ story so well that we can identify stories that are not true. And we have to be deeply intentional with our time and deeply intentional with the stories we engage with that influence us and shape us. We have to be a discerning people because the rest of the world is drowning in an overabundance of information and input that is turning everyone into either apathetic machines or rage machines. But in a world that is overflowing with stories, and it's a world that's only going to get even more mind-numbing with the introduction of AI, we have to be a people of clarity who are able to discern truth, who before responding to something we see or something we hear, we use great wisdom and insight given to us through the Spirit of God, that we prayerfully and thoughtfully discern everything we encounter to be a people of great clarity and a people of great focus. The last opponent and danger is this idea of revisionism or of drift. Right? And this is especially the case for the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people, when you see their great failures in the Old Testament, it's not that they take Yahweh and they take his worship and they throw it in the dumpster. What they do is they commit this sin of syncretism, where they take other stories, they take other idols and other gods and introduce it into the Hebrew worship. The story that they live out, the story of their redemption and their rescue and their blessing changes. Where it's not just Yahweh who blessed them and rescued them. No, it's Yahweh and Baal and Asherah and all these other gods. And so they drift and their worship becomes greatly corrupted as they worship false gods and other idols. So as Christians, we can fall into the same trap. We fall into the same trap where we think we need more than God. Or our mission starts to drift and we move away from the simple gospel. We have to be a people who regularly examine ourselves, to be a people who regularly refocus. And this is the entire heart of the Reformation. There's this Latin phrase, ad fontes, which simply means back to the sources. If we are going to be good bearers and sharers of the gospel, we have to be a people who regularly refocus, who humble ourselves, who examine ourselves, who are willing to say, hey, is this story true? That we be wise in our examination. And we do this every week when we gather together, that we follow the biblical call, that when we receive the body and blood of Christ, when we receive the communion elements, that we examine ourselves. Because it is so easy to become distracted. It is so easy to drift. It is so easy for the stories to change in our minds and to change ever so slightly to the point that they can change in huge, major ways, but it's been changing so slowly over time we never even noticed. There's a reason why the people of Israel shift from seeing God clearly, seeing him as a pillar of smoke or a pillar of fire right in front of them, and then they go on to build a golden calf. All right? We have to be people who care about the story of Jesus, who understand it with clarity, and who keep it near and dear to our hearts, that we would be a humble people who come before God in repentance daily, saying, God, teach me, guide me, lead me, help me to refocus day in and day out. God, in this Joshua passage, calls the Hebrew people to be a people who bear the story of redemption and grace and to share it with each generation. And we have that same call today, You are here for a reason. There's a story behind why you're here. There is a story behind how you came to know Christ. There's a story behind everything. Every week, we're going to have these remember cards, and every week we're going to have a particular way to respond and a particular thing to remember. And this week, I just want to urge you, write down the story of how Jesus saved you, the story of how you ended up here, the story of how you saw God work in a mighty way to rescue you from slavery, the story of how God led you into something good, into something new, into something life-changing. What is the most important story in your life? That if you had to write, like a memoir, if you had to write one story to share with your children or your grandchildren or the world, what is the most defining, what is the most important story of your life? Maybe you've forgotten it. Maybe you've become distracted. Maybe you've been surrounded by so many stories you don't even know what is the most important. But as a people, as a church, we have to take this call to refocus, that we would fall in love with our first love again, that we would take this call seriously to know the story of Christ, to bear it, and to share it with everyone we encounter. Because if we don't, how will people believe if they don't hear? How will they hear if they are not told the story? If you would you pray with me? Lord, we thank you that you are a good God. And we thank you that you have done an incredible work, that you know us and you love us, that you have rescued us from sin and rescued us from death. So, Lord, may we take this call seriously to bear and to share the story of who you are and how much you love us and what you have done. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.